Even in terms of the tariff, reciprocal tax rates that have been imposed, or tariff rates, it differs quite significantly. You know, for Vietnam, as was just discussed, is about 46%, and the other side you have Singapore, which has an FTA with the US. It's at about 10%, which is the universal tariff rate that has been announced. So I don't think you can really make a broad brush in terms of the impact on the region on a whole. I would think it's a net negative, but there is some time before these are implemented, so there could be, again, some negotiations. I'm sure the U.S. Administration is looking at two things very closely. First, which other country puts some counter tariffs, takes counter action on the U.S., and the second one will be what happens to currencies. If you dial back to Trump 1.0, you had some countries, especially China, where currency fell to the extent which kind of offset the impact on the tariff. Coming back to your question, Martin, certainly I think I wouldn't, because there's a universal tariff, there is no place to hide, so to speak. But I think different countries will approach it differently, and I think the net impact on US will also be different, because if you see Vietnam's basket is much more manufactured goods, everything spanning from electronics to footwear and in between. So the impact on the net consumer on the American side will also be important. But at this point, I'm sure all the Asian administration are looking very closely to see if there's any exemptions or any concessions they could make or get in return, and lower the net impact.
JP?
So we've seen how the Singapore dollar and the ringgit have now reacted. And I want to pivot actually to currencies, because as we know, this is probably the most sensitive of the asset classes, especially when we talk about trade and currencies and exchange rates and everything. Just how big an impact might we see it have on the broader ASEAN currency space, and how immediate might this actually be? And I think that's the thing. I mean, how quickly can we expect perhaps an outsized move from the other currencies that we're waiting to come online later on?
I think as for a start, of course, over the next few hours, the markets open. Indonesia is closed because they are in Lebaran, the Holy Week. So coming back to the currencies, I think most of the ASEAN currencies will be looking at yuan very closely, because they draw quite a strong correlation. So if the yuan shows signs of weakness, and where the impact, if you put together all the tariff that has gone up on China, it's almost 54%, much higher than what happened under the Trump first term. So they will be drawing a direction from there. So if you look at what happened in the past month in March, most of the ASEAN currencies, barring rupiah, have gained because of what happened to the US dollar. I would think starting now, we will look at what the yuan is going to do. If it shows relative stability, which it has maintained to show in the past few months, I would think the ASEAN currencies would take a bit of a knock, but not outsized. And among them, like you already mentioned, Singapore dollar is showing a bit of firmness, and the others not so much. And the ASEAN 6 countries that we had looked at, we had cut this on various parameters, about 5 parameters, and Thailand and Vietnam really stood out to us on various fronts. Connection to US, what kind of exposure to semiconductors, for example, is one of the sectors that has been spoken about. And those were the two countries we were most concerned about, and those are the two countries that have really faced among the highest tariff rates.
Okay, so here's a concern I want to bring up, actually, because when we spoke to the folks at Top Glove a few months ago, actually, they were happy that they were going to see these tariffs on Chinese rubber gloves going to the US, thus giving them more market share, but they were concerned that now these Chinese goods that are facing higher tariffs might try to find markets outside, which means that they might have to face a battle in their other markets as well. Yeah. Because we're seeing these huge tariffs on China, will it prompt the Chinese perhaps to look at other markets like ASEAN for which they can divert their goods? And thus, could that also have another impact on economies in Southeast Asia that might have to deal with Chinese imports coming in?
I mean, come on, let's say it. I'll say it, right? I mean, a lot of Southeast Asian countries are, I think, probably secretly worried that with China, if they turn their attention to them, it's going to be, look, you're going to dump on us your excess capacity? I'm not sure I want that, right? That's the worry.
Yeah, when you start the discussion on tariffs, it's always this: who is it inflationary for, and who is it deflationary for? Or deflationary or disinflationary. So I would think ASEAN comes in the latter, which is that the impact would be disflationary, because like you rightly mentioned, from China, from other countries in the region, there will be a bit of movement within, and that is what we've got, cascading tariffs. In fact, you have seen even countries like India and countries like Vietnam have already imposed some counter tariffs or safeguard duties, as they call it, on steel coming from China, coming from South Korea. So I think if these tax rates, which are tariff rates, which are much higher than what was anticipated, remain, you would see a lot more action within each other in the country as well, because you'll be really wary. You'll be protecting your own production base rather than inviting more low-cost producers.